Welcome to Baker Briefing. Today's episode is hosted by Kelsey Norman, a fellow for the Middle East at the Baker Institute and the director of our Women's Rights, Human Rights, and Refugees program. Her work is focused on refugee and migration issues in the Middle East and globally, as well as women's rights, human rights, comparative political institutions, international relations, and Middle East and North African politics. She is published through the Institute and elsewhere, most recently in Foreign Policy magazine, on the humanitarian disaster happening in Sudan. I'll let Kelsey take it from here. Thanks for listening.
Sudan is now entering its third year of civil war and one of the most devastating conflicts in recent memory. Over 150,000 people have been killed, over 10 million have been displaced, and an estimated 25 million are at risk of starvation. The conflict is the latest chapter in Sudan's tumultuous postcolonial history. After former President Omar al-Bashir, whose dictatorship began in the late 1980s, was finally ousted by a popular uprising in 2019, disagreements between the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and the Paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, RSF, over the future governance of the country led to the start of the current conflict on April 15, 2023. 2 years in, and with the Sudanese Armed Forces having just retaken the capital city, Khartoum, what happens now? Are there any prospects for negotiations toward peace? And what role should foreign governments and NGOs be playing? Joining me today are two experts on politics and governance in Sudan. Salah Ben Hammou, a postdoctoral associate whose research at our Center for the Middle East focuses on the politics of military coups, authoritarian regimes, and democratization, especially in the Middle East, North Africa, and Susan Stigant, formerly the director of the Africa program at the U.S. Institute for Peace. Susan has led efforts to design and implement inclusive constitutional reform and national dialogue processes, including in South Sudan from 2005 to 2011. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Kelsey Norman, a fellow for the Middle East and director of the Women's Rights, Human Rights, and Refugees program at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas. And this is Baker Briefing. Salah and Susan, welcome to the show. Susan, for those who haven't been tracking the conflict, can you give an overview of where we are today? How did the current war begin, and where do things stand today militarily?
Well, if we go back 2 years to April 2023, the war really started with a confrontation between the Sudan Armed Forces under General Burhan and the Rapid Support Forces under General Hemeti. The tensions had been growing about who would control the military, who would be in charge, what powers and authorities would be held by each, and how an integration of those forces could come together. So at its very basis, this is about power. It's about command, it's about access to resources and control of everything from foreign relations to the most important types of financial flows that go in and out of the country. The war started in the capital quite spectacularly, quickly spread, pushing most of the population out of Khartoum itself, quickly spread further east and south of the capital. And over the course of the war, we've essentially seen fighting in most parts of the country. Sometimes when people say, here, there's a war in Sudan, they sort of aren't surprised because people have just heard about conflict in Sudan. But this conflict today is different. We've seen a tremendous and horrible escalation in Darfur in the west of the country, been called genocide by governments and ethnic cleansing. We've also seen the war spread out to the east near Port Sudan that became the de facto capital of the country under the Sudan Armed Forces itself. So where we are today, Khartoum has been retaken by the Sudan Armed Forces. And this is not unimportant, but in my view, we don't see any signs that either the SAF or the RSF believe that they are at a point where fighting is not the best option for them. We've also seen the mass mobilization of communities and citizens, so into defense forces and the splitting of other armed groups that have interests, whether that's protecting their communities or advancing for power in their areas or at the center. So the war is much more complicated than two generals fighting against each other. And I fear the war will go on much longer than who controls the capital city or not.
Thanks for that really helpful overview, Susan. Salah, can you explain a bit about the longer history of authoritarian rule in Sudan and how this has become such a devastating conflict in terms of the impact on civilians?
Thank you, Kelsey. So thinking about the history of authoritarianism in Sudan specifically, something that's important to keep in mind is that the current conflict now is being waged by the vestiges of a former authoritarian regime, specifically that of Omar al-Bashir. So for those who are unfamiliar, Omar al-Bashir himself came from the Sudanese armed forces and essentially staged a coup in 1989 with the help of Islamist forces and instituted a 30-year-long dictatorship. Over the span of this dictatorship, he also created a paramilitary organization known as the Rapid Support Forces, which initially grew out of militia groups in Darfur who were responsible for the genocide there under Bashir's orders. But if we take a bit of a broader view beyond just the Bashir regime, if we think about authoritarianism in Sudan a little bit from a wider lens, we could see that there's usually a story that's told about an initial struggle for a democratic transition or an initial struggle for democracy more generally, and anti-democratic forces essentially stepping in and vetoing any type of democratic gains. So many people don't know this, but Sudan initially started out in 1956 as a democratic parliamentary system. And it wasn't 2 years into their experiment with democracy that a coup was staged. And it wasn't until 1964 that popular mobilization effectively drove the dictator out and once again introduced an experiment with democracy. And so that would be, again, sidelined by another military coup. This is a consistent thread in the story of the struggle for democracy in Sudan and the persistence of authoritarianism, that militarized politics come front and center. So as much as we view this conflict as a war between two generals, it's also very much a war against civilians on the ground, because it's essentially between two actors who are essentially trying to safeguard their interests and gain the upper hand on the other while neglecting the good of the civilian population more generally. To the extent that this has had a devastating impact on civilians on the ground, aside from the political realm, there's also just been a complete lack of responsibility or restraint on either actor's side to basically implement civilian protection. So with that lens in mind, the persistence of authoritarianism in Sudan goes hand in hand with the devastation we're seeing to civilian life on the ground as well.
Thanks, Ella, for that reminder that just as we've seen such a tumultuous military history and repeated coup attempts or successful coups, we've also seen continued popular mobilization against this return to authoritarianism throughout Sudan's postcolonial history. So, Susan, both sides, the SAF and the RSF, have been accused of war crimes, and there's evidence of ethnic cleansing by the RSF. What's the scale of the humanitarian crisis in Sudan?
I think in many ways it's really undescribable. When we talk about humanitarian crisis, we're using these numbers that seem so abstract from the reality of people's lives. But Sudan is the largest displacement crisis in the world. And we know that at this point, the global displacement is worse than it has ever been in history. So just to situate how serious that is, I think at least half of all people displaced are children. 90% of children are out of school in the country. The hunger situation is absolutely horrendous. 2/3 of the population of 45 to 50 million people needs food assistance to survive. That means that they can't buy it in markets, they can't get it themselves, and they won't survive without outside help. There have been declarations of famine, which is this word that we use and I think should probably touch us all because we remember seeing it on TV, but it's this technical exercise at a point where it is almost impossible to save lives because food cannot get to people fast enough. So the humanitarian situation is really terrible. I was just talking to a friend who was in Khartoum, who's worked in humanitarian response all around the world. And she said she had never seen anything as bad. And part of that is because there is no international presence. And this relates to the cuts in humanitarian funding. It relates to the many other competing priorities. It also relates to access, where places haven't been accessible because of the fighting that's ongoing. So it's dire. I will say that the bright spot in Sudan is also in the humanitarian space. And that relates back to what Salah was saying about the organizing of citizens. And so the response by the organized groups that were the people who led the revolution in 2019, right? So Sudanese of all genders, of all ages, from all geographies came together to overthrow Bashir. That same basis of organizing has created what are called emergency response rooms. So these are mutual aid organizations that are crowdsourcing all capacities, whether it's midwives or people who know first aid, people who can get little food that is available, money that can be used in markets, can transport things, medicines, and providing that to communities in a way that is done on the basis of accountability to people who need it most. And in my mind, this is the foundation that remains. If you ask me what is like Sudanese pride and nationality, what is the future of the country, it's that. And that's the frontline response to this absolutely horrendous, and I think really for most of us, this shameful situation that the Sudanese people find themselves in.
Yeah, thank you so much for mentioning the civilian agency and the incredible amount of mutual aid that's been keeping people afloat amid such devastation. I think that's such an important facet of this to bring up. Salah, turning now to the military, how are different military factions perceived by civilians? What does support domestically and internationally look like for them?
I'll start with the domestic angle first. And there have been a variety of different currents of thoughts running through how domestic actors are perceiving the military factions, specifically RSF and SAF, within the country. And there's usually a popular opinion that SAF is somehow a little bit more popular relative to RSF. And something that I would like to emphasize about that point is when folks on the ground are supporting SAF, it isn't necessarily because they view them as a good actor or as more capable of bringing an end to the conflict or as a more viable governing source. It's more out of desperation. For instance, there have been a variety of different commentaries that support that folks on the ground, specifically associated with emergency response rooms, because these folks have been somewhat assisting in protecting their communities in SAF-controlled areas from RSF, that there is an association that they somehow support SAF more so. But again, I'll emphasize that is a measure out of desperation rather than as a signal of clear support. And as far as the RSF goes, they have very little domestic support. Their main sources of support are coming from an international angle. And specifically, I would point out that the United Arab Emirates have been a key financial supporter of RSF. When it comes to the Sudanese armed forces and Burhan more specifically, there is going to be international support mostly coming from the Saudis and the Egyptians and to some extent the Russians as well as specific elements of Sudanese diaspora, but not of the Sudanese diaspora that are related to like the mutual aid networks or the folks on the ground, but more so associated with the former regime and their various financial partners that are located in different parts of the world, specifically like Qatar and Turkey. So in terms of that angle, that is another thing that I would emphasize when it comes to this element of domestic support. The folks who are supporting SAF, aside from out of desperation, there are also a segment of the population that were once SAF's allies under the former regime of Omar al-Bashir that support SAF out of a desire to retrieve any lost interests that they had under the initial transition in 2019.
Okay, that's important nuance. Turning back to the issue of ethnic cleansing, this isn't the first time that we've seen this happen in Sudan or the Darfur region. How much of what we're seeing now ties back to older tensions between ethnic groups, and how much of it is a new development? And if Sudan can get to a point where it's ready to rebuild, how does it grapple with these regional and minority tensions?
So something about another common current theme with the older tension between ethnic groups, something I'll also emphasize is that previous tensions were not so much because of ancient hatreds, as a lot of folks would imply, but rather there was very much a sense of neglect from the center to the periphery, specifically with the Arab Muslim center in Khartoum and the peripheries, for instance, in the West and Darfur. So to the extent that this is a product of these older tensions, it's a product that originated out of the neglect from the center historically since independence, since even a little bit before independence, that has perpetuated with every single government in Sudan. And that also speaks to the creation of the RSF more generally, because these were folks that were empowered as a means to basically suppress any form of opposition in the South. So when we continue to see reports of ethnic cleansing and genocide in Darfur, it's related to, once again, an attempt to squash any opposition that would be in the peripheries. In a post-war Sudan, where rebuilding the country with regional and ethnic minorities in mind would need to be a priority, it would need to require integration as an initial starting point. Previously, they had just been completely neglected through various forms of federalism where they weren't receiving any types of genuine government assistance. They were simply left to their own devices, and that led to just marginalization. So in order for a post-war Sudan to truly thrive as it relates to regional and ethnic minorities, there would need to be a sense of integration into the center.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I would add maybe that even prior to independence under the Anglo-Egyptian condominium and colonial rule, that was very much a strategy that was used by colonial powers to amplify the center to the detriment of the periphery that we see continued on today. In March, the SAF's recapture of Khartoum, Sudan's capital city, was seen as a major turning point. Now, almost a month later, Has this been a turning point? What's changed for the military factions and for civilians who are living under occupation or who are displaced?
So I'll defer back to what Susan had said initially, and that's this idea that perhaps for strictly realpolitik or battlefield dynamics, there has been a turning point in terms of SAF regaining the upper hand as it relates to the conflict more generally, but it does not shift the trajectory towards a solution to the end of the conflict in the slightest. If anything, this just continues to fuel the ongoing tensions between RSF and SAF, and if anything, it drives RSF back to their home territory to regroup and hit back harder. And I think that's where we're heading now at this point. The rhetoric that's been coming out of RSF has been not one of we're willing to negotiate, it's more of we're willing to burn the country down before we allow you to take the center back. So if anything, I would expect sustained fighting to continue. And I think that's simply where we're heading.
Susan, we're actually recording this on the same day that the UK is co-hosting a conference meant to pressure SAF and the RSF toward a ceasefire. They haven't invited representatives from these factions, so tell us how the international community is approaching this.
That is a great question. And I think many have struggled to figure out what is the strategy that the international community is taking, and is there a possibility for a coherent approach? I fear that until now, we have not seen a shared, coherent approach by the international community. It's not to say that it's not difficult. We're living in a global moment where a role that would have been taken up by multilateral institutions with a push from the United States and coordination with other actors and countries that have interests in the country, that would have been a typical pathway, right? We've seen success for Sudan and South Sudan in their negotiations in the past when a strong special envoy was appointed. Leadership and mandate was driven by the African Union's Peace and Security Council. The UN Security Council could come in behind. The United States could push. The regional bodies could push. And we're just not in a moment where the world works in that way. And so as a result, we've seen this incredibly fragmented approach, sort of push and pull between people advocating and pushing for a humanitarian response. A push and pull between people who are saying, no, first we have to stop the fighting. A push and pull between saying we're horrified by the lack of protection of civilians, but first we need them to stop fighting. So I guess my greatest hope of what's discussed in London is perhaps a sober realization that this is a moment where maybe there's only one thing that can be done at a time. I think if someone were to ask my advice on what is that thing that is possible, it seems to me that protection of civilians is so urgent and could be something that could be framed in the interests of the SAF and the RSF as they gain and fight with each other in Khartoum, in Al-Fashir, in Darfur, where 2 million people have been under siege. And I think we just don't have the liberty of undertaking too many tracks at once at this stage. And I hope that the leadership that the UK has shown at this point can be reciprocated. And I also hope that the diplomats do their homework and go and consult with the SAF and go and consult with the Rapid Support Forces. Because at the end of the day, we may be horrified by behavior. We may have views about who should win and who should lose and what a solution looks like. But these are the people who are holding the guns, who have all recourse to power at this stage. And they have to be part of the conversation.
That makes sense. As you said earlier, there's very obviously a massive humanitarian crisis in Sudan. And there's also a crisis of aid. So what has the impact been of cuts to aid budgets we're seeing, not just with the dismantling of USAID in the US, but also elsewhere? And how might funding cuts to academic groups that are monitoring the conflict also factor in?
I think on the funding side right now, there is so much confusion, at least from the U.S. funding to humanitarian assistance. USAID and the United States have been the largest contributor to the humanitarian response in Sudan by a significant amount. I think if you add together what Germany, the European Commission, and a couple of other donors provide, it still doesn't add up to what the U.S. has been funding in humanitarian space. So the initial foreign assistance freeze led to all assistance grinding to a halt. And that's those who are providing the direct delivery, the people who are maintaining warehouses where food is kept, food that was sitting on boats, coming into ports, and all of the infrastructure, the supply chain that is required to move food across borders and assistance to people who need it most. The U.S. administration has said that anything that is life-saving should go ahead. But from what we understand, there are still confusing signals to the people who need to be implementing It's not always clear that there's somebody sitting in the chair who has to hit the payment button for these organizations to be paid for work performed already, much less the incredibly expensive costs of moving food, usually U.S.-grown food, to the people who need it most. The situation is terribly bleak at the moment. I think there are two ways to sort of think about it in a way forward. One will need to be a very affirmative statement, and maybe this will happen in London, actually, by the United States, to signal to partners, to the World Food Programme, to UNICEF, to NGOs, go forward with delivery, and maybe some political pressure to release the necessary payments. And then I think second, there needs to be some really creative thinking about what does humanitarian assistance look like. And the mutual aid groups can be part of that. I think it would be too much to expect that they can absorb all of those needs, as well as the infrastructure that has to go along to get the right things to the right people in the right places in time.
Final question for both of you. Rebuilding a nation that has endured conflict for years like Sudan is going to be a very difficult task that requires lots of dialogue and coalition building. What will have to happen for Sudan to get to that point? Salah?
So I'll start with a few non-negotiables that I have in mind for Sudan to actually rebuild itself once the conflict dies down or once the conflict has reached some type of resolution. And I think regardless of which actor emerges as victorious or if they reach a stalemate at the end of this conflict, I think something that would need to happen is you absolutely need a restructuring of the political system that has basically created this type of situation. And specifically, I mean, the actors and the faces that we're used to seeing, such as the Burhans and the Hemedis, will have to completely step aside. And I see this as more tenable as it relates to SAF than I do with RSF. Whereas RSF is completely consolidated in the hands of Hemedi and his family, there is an alternative to SAF where you can find alternative channels and alternative people who might be willing to negotiate more so with civilian political actors. But that's another element that would need to be addressed in a post-war Sudan is militarized politics would need to come to a halt once and for all. Much of what we've seen throughout Sudan's political history in the postcolonial sense as well as in more recent memory is a product of negotiating with the military as a viable political actor. While they might be necessary in an immediate interim period, there's no reason that they need to be sticking around in actual political spaces. I think time and time again, the international community has engaged with the military as a viable political actor, and that's emboldened them in the sense that they can continue to view themselves as the guarantors or the protectors of the nation. And as it related to the coup in 2021, when SAF and RSF jointly seized power together, I think that was a product of them viewing themselves as viable and legitimate political actors as well. So one thing that I would say for post-war Sudan is the end of the military's involvement in politics would need to be a non-negotiable.
Okay. Tall order.
Yeah.
And how about you, Susan? Final word.
I love that Salah gave the tall order. That's great. So maybe three things. One, I mean, the level of mobilization of particularly young men across the country and the targeting of young women in the violence is going to take incredible attention and healing. Sudanese have lived through this before. They know what to do, and there will need to be time and space to address that. And I think one of the biggest challenges will be people have literally been pitted, community and family, against each other. And so figuring out a way to bridge that into the future, I think will be tremendously painful. Second is really, I think, for the international community, which is that we know recovering from war, we know going into transitions out of military leadership, it requires timely and politically relevant financial assistance to allow any future government to actually deliver on the very basics that citizens expect and deserve. Part of the challenge, I think, coming out of Sudan's 2019 revolution is that the expectations put in front of a civilian government, which wasn't even a fully civilian government, were so high, with both of their hands tied behind their back because of debt and constraints. I really hope there will be a different approach so that it is not the next political class that is saddled with that responsibility. And I think almost inevitably a failure to live up to the great needs and expectations and hopes that people have. And then finally, I'll go back to these mutual aid, emergency response rooms, resistance committees that came out of the revolution. I think once a deal is reached, there will be a temptation for political leaders who have been busy doing politicking outside of the country to step back in and to bring the wisdom and the knowledge that they have. And they have tremendous wisdom and knowledge. Of all the places I've worked in the world, Sudanese are the most politically astute people who I know. But if they step back in and crowd out the people who were on the front line, who have been holding country, communities, families, body and soul of Sudanese people together, I fear that that will miss this next opportunity that Sudan may have for its own better, more peaceful future. So that's a tall order too, but I think possible.
Thank you both so much for joining us here on Baker Briefing.
Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing the United States, Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zamel with support from Sami Beck. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more. Thanks for listening.